Basically, we're asking this question here. How did Islam begin? Who was Muhammad? And where did the Quran come from? Now, I'm interested in asking what history tells us about these three areas. What does history say concerning how Islam began? According to Islam, and if you ask any Muslim, they'll say this, that Muhammad is the last and greatest prophet, that the Quran is his revelation, that it is the eternal revelation that has always existed, was revealed to him over a 22-year period from 610 to 632. That is the final revelation, and it corrects everything that's gone before. So we don't need anything after the Quran, and that Islam, therefore, is the final religion based on Muhammad's, not only his life, but also his sayings. That's the Sunnah of the Prophet. That would be the Sirah and the Hadith. Now, conclusion is, of course, that Islam is completely dependent on the Book and the Man, the Quran and Muhammad. Absolutely dependent on those two. Without the book, without the man, Islam falls. And I would suggest that we are also dependent on a book and a man as well, are we not? We also have a Bible and we have Jesus Christ. So in some ways, everything I'm going to say today should also be asked of Christianity. And I would suggest of any religion, you should ask the same thing. If there is a scriptured religion, as Islam and Christianity are, we must also ask these historical questions. Now, what we want to do, therefore, is look at the Book of the Man. And we want to say and ask whether or not history gives us a different story. Now, what do Muslims believe? Well, they believe that Muhammad was born in 570, that in 610 he went into a cave called the Hira cave, and there he met an angel called Jibril, or Gabriel as we would know him, who said Akra, which means recite. He says, Ma Akra, I cannot recite. He could not read or write. And so the angel squeezed him 3 times. Finally, after the 3rd time, let him go. He went back to Mecca, went and told his wife Khadija, the only wife of that time, what had just happened. She did a test, gave 3 different tests, passed all 3, then told him to go see her cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal. And having seen the cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal, recited and related what had just happened in the cave. It is Waraka ibn Nawfal that tells Muhammad he is a prophet. Waraka ibn Nawfal was a Nestorian Christian. That's one of the ironies of history. You have a Nestorian Christian giving the authority for Muhammad as a prophet right there in 610. Now, from 610 to 622, he then received these revelations. When you look at the Quran, the last half of the Quran, from Surah 20 up to 114, that's the Meccan surahs, according to Islamic tradition. Remember, everything I'm telling you is what the traditions tell us. This is the classical account. Then in 621, he wakes up in the middle of the night, and he's told to get on the back of the winged horse called the Burak, goes up to Jerusalem, ascends the 7 heavens, meets God, or Allah, who tells him to pray 50 times a day, comes down 2 heavens to the 5th heaven. Moses asks him, how many times are you to pray? 50 times, he's told. And so he says, go back and see if you can get it back down. So he bounces back between Allah and Moses, between the 7th and 5th heaven, gets it down to 45, 40, 35, 30, 15, 10, finally down to 5 prayers. Moses says, that's enough. So then he heads on down to earth, goes back to Mecca. That's the Miraj. That's the story of the Miraj. Happens in 621. In 622, then, he moves from Mecca up to Medina with about 80 followers. And that starts the political agenda. That's where he starts to take control. That's where he starts to get authority. And then you have the Medinan surahs, the first half of the Quran, which is only 20 chapters, much longer chapters. And that's where the problem begins for most Muslims even today. So from 622 to 632, the last 10 years of his life, you have these Medinan revelations. In 630, he goes and marches down into Mecca, takes it over without firing a shot. In 632, he suddenly dies, as most people tend to do. Now, we don't know how he died. Some traditions say he was poisoned. Whatever the case is, he dies in 632 without ever having written the Quran down. It still was not compiled. It was received, but not written down, okay? Then in 632 to 634, you have Abu Bakr, who's the first caliph. He's the first to write the Quran down. And that's given to one of Muhammad's wives named Hafsa. She keeps it under her bed for about 18 years. Umar comes to power from 634 to 644. In the next 10 years, he is killed. Uthman takes over power, and it's Uthman from 644 to 656, the next 12 years. In that period, he has the Quran rewritten again because there are many different versions appearing, according to the traditions. And then the Quran is finalized. So the Quran that we have today is that Quran. And when you talk to Muslims, they'll call it the Uthmanic recension. This is the Uthmanic Quran they talk about. About 650 is the date that they give to it. He is killed, and then in 656 to 661, Ali, who the Shiites believe is the rightful heir to Muhammad. He is the adopted son of Muhammad. He takes over power for only 5 years, and then is killed by Muawiyah there at the Battle of Siffin. Now, that's the classical account. Have any of you heard any other account? That's just the bare bones. I'm just giving you a quick skeleton. That's the classical account that everybody is taught all over the world. You go to any university, any college, any school in the world, and you'll hear this account. That's how Islam began, with this man in that place doing those things at that time. Do any of you doubt it? Is there any reason to doubt it? Now, you two guys who put your hands up, you're smiling because I know where you're going to go with this. But does anybody else doubt it? Why could you and why should you doubt it? There's no reason to doubt it, because that's all we've been told. We're going to show you that there's some problems with this. First of all, everything I've just told you comes from whom? Who is the person that tells us who Muhammad is, what he did, where he lived, how the Quran was revealed? Well, you need to go to his biography. Now, who should have written his biography? Somebody living at his time, somebody who knew him, right? You would hope that someone who knew would write down what he did and what he said. The first man to write down anything about him is Ibn Ishaq. Look at the day he dies. 765. Muhammad died in 632. How many years? But we don't have anything of Ibn Ishaq. Nothing exists from Ibn Ishaq's. We don't know anything that he said except because of this man, Ibn Hisham. Ibn Hisham takes what Ibn Ishaq writes, is given to it by another one, a disciple of Ibn Ishaq, and he throwaways anything that he doesn't like and only retains what he likes, and finally writes it down in 833. Muhammad dies in 632. How many years? 200. So the first biography we have of Muhammad is 200 years after the fact. Nothing earlier than Ibn Hisham. Does that bother any of you? What about what Muhammad said? Because that's much greater. The hadith are much more prolific. The first person to write down the hadith would be this man here, Al-Bukhari. Sahih Bukhari is what is known as. Sahih Bukhari, he dies in 870. He wrote between 850 and 870, that 20-year period. So everything we know about what Muhammad said comes from this man and others who come after. Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, Tirmidhi, and the others. But they all come after Al-Bukhari. That's 240 years after the fact. Which means everything we know about who Muhammad is, what he said, and as far as the tafsir is concerned, and the tahriq, which would be the commentaries that explain the Quran, and the tahriq, which would be the histories of mankind, all first written by this man, Al-Tabari, and he dies in 923. That's the 10th century. So everything we know about what happened over here in the 7th century does not come from the 8th century. It comes from the 9th century, 200 to 300 years after the fact. And that's why today, historians are asking, hold on a minute, let's look at Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is also a historical figure. He also lived in history. He also lived in a certain place, did certain things, said different things. We know about his biography, do we not? Is there not a siddha of Jesus written down? Yes, there is. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Is there not also the hadith of Jesus, which would be the sayings of Jesus? Yes, there is. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In my Bible, whenever Jesus speaks, it's red letters. That's the hadith of Jesus. So there's the parallels. Those are the parallels. The New Testament basically is nothing more than the sunnah of Jesus. Like you have the sunnah of Muhammad, you have the sunnah of Jesus. But take a look and see when they were written down. We know that Paul's letters are written within 20 to 30 years. We know that 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are written within 40 years of Christ's death. We know that John comes much later, around 92 AD. So 60 years is the latest we get. Now, hold on a minute. Even if you look at those 4, 2 of them actually knew Jesus, did they not? Matthew and John were actually disciples of Jesus. They lived with him. They saw what he did. They heard what he said. They wrote down what they knew. And the other 2, Mark and Luke, got it from the eyewitnesses. So at the most, what you would say, the earliest that we have for the hadith and the siddha and the tafsir, because the tafsir would be the commentaries, that's Paul's letters. Commentaries means explains what Jesus did. That's what Paul does in Ephesus, in Philippi, in Corinth, in Colossus. He then writes and expounds on what Jesus said and did. There's the commentaries. The tahriq would be the book of Acts, the history of the early church. So we've got the exact same four genres in the New Testament that they have in Islam. But whereas our tafsir and our sunnah of Jesus comes within 15 to 60 years of Christ's death, written by the eyewitnesses and those who knew the eyewitnesses, the sunnah of Muhammad comes to 200 to 300 years later. If we were dependent on the gospel of Jesus Christ from what Islam is dependent on, we would know nothing about what Jesus did or said until the 3rd century. How would we defend him? Yet, is this the first time you're hearing this? Is this taught in any school? Why aren't they teaching this in Bible schools and seminaries? Why aren't we being told just how hopeless an authority Islam is dependent on? That's just the first problem. We're going to get into lots of problems today. Now, that's why the scholars are now asking some very deep questions. They're asking and saying, Islam as we know it did not exist in the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years. The Quran probably was not revealed to one man in 22 years, but looks like it evolved over a period of 50 to 100 years. That's a pretty big statement. Therefore, their conclusion is the history of Islam, at least from the time of Caliph Abdul Malik, he is the one, the Caliph from the Marwanid Caliphate under the Umayyad Caliphate, from 685 to 705, it is he that we're now looking at, and almost all the scholars are looking at him, because that's where we see Islam beginning. But Muhammad died in 632. He comes to power in 685. Do your maths. You can see the problem. We'll unpack that a bit. So the scholars' conclusion, and this is what they're asking, if so much of the history of early Islam was written down so late, why did they take so long to write it down? Ask your Muslim friends this. I ask them all the time, and they say, well, they were illiterate. Hold on a minute. Illiterate. Do you really believe that they were illiterate? Remember, by 642, they had taken over Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo. Within 10 years of the Prophet Muhammad's death, within 10 years, the 5 great cities of the Levant were under their jurisdiction. And outside of Jerusalem, they're still under their jurisdiction, 1400 years later. By the end of the 7th century, by the time Abdul Malik comes to power, we're still in the 7th century, they controlled all the land from Spain all the way to India. Are you telling me that nobody between Spain and India could read or write? Really? Do you really believe that people could not read or write in these great cities? Listen, in Cairo, certainly in Alexandria, they had a library that was burnt in the 5th century. Certainly they could read or write. You can't make that excuse anymore. And don't Muslims say that the Quran was written down? Do they not tell us that a man named Zayd ibn Thabit was the secretary of Muhammad? He is the one that's given the responsibility for giving us the Uthmanic recension. The Uthmanic recension, what does that mean? It means it's a book, it's a codex. They date that to 650. So certainly they could write the Quran. If they could write the Quran, why couldn't they write about Muhammad? Where did they get the biographers get their material from? Where did Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim? Where did Ibn Dawud? Where did Ibn Hisham, Al-Waqidi, Ibn Ishaq, where did these guys get their material from? Now, you can ask your Muslim friends. We did a debate last Sunday at Speaker's Corner, and this came out. It's brilliant. You can go up on Fander Films and look at it and see what happened. They could not walk away from this, and they dare not walk away from this, because we now know that all of these biographies, every one of these sayings, these akhbar, as they call it, 600,000 of them that were given to Al-Bukhari alone. 600,000. He was to whittle down and throw away that which did not make any sense. He threw away 98% of it, only retained 2% of it, only retained 7,397 out of 600,000. He whittled it down to 7,397. 2%. In the late 9th century. Why did he throw out 98%? And where is that 98%? Wouldn't you like to look at it? I would like to look at it. I would like to know what his criteria was for destroying it, and throwing it away. And how did he know in the 9th century what Muhammad said in the 7th century? He wasn't there. He never knew Muhammad. Everything that he was dependent on, and every one of these akhbars, are based on a chain of names called isnad. So-and-so got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who got it from the companion of the Prophet. What's that tell you? Oral tradition. All based on oral tradition. Because none of the so-and-sos wrote down anything of what they passed on. Nothing was written down. Now can you see why the historians are asking these questions? They say, should we trust it? Should we not therefore go back to the 7th century and check out what actually happened? Now, any historian should do the same. That's the historical work. That's the historical task. And that's what we're going to do today. Because I don't trust that 9th century and 10th century material. I want to see exactly what happened in the 7th century. So, what do they find? Now, just before we do that, I just want to put this map up there to show you what we're looking at. By 661, all the material, all that area in brown was under Arab control. I have Islam there in quotes because we're going to find out that this is not even the right name. But we'll get to that. Use Arab for now, Arab control. And the people were much more of an impact as this book here, Quranic Geography. How many of you know about this book? Have you read it? Please do read it. I'm going to show you why. This book is probably going to do more damage than any other one book. Dr. Dan Gibson is from Canada. He spent 20 years researching this book, spent and lived there amongst the Bedouin, there in the Middle East, got to know them intimately, and went all over the Middle East trying to find out these geographical locations that are in the Quran. We're going to unpack that a little bit in a while. Hold on to that. This book, I think, is going to do more damage than any other, and you'll see why once we unpack it. But here's their concerns, and this is the problem right here. Just take a look at these phrases that I have, these bullet points that I have. The first Arab inscription referencing Muhammad, do you notice I'm using the word Arabic? The first Arab inscription referencing the name Muhammad is not till 691. Muhammad died in 632. The first reference to Muslims, now they do not call themselves Muslims. That's the problem. Nowhere can we find any reference to people called Muslims until the 690s. For 60 years, they used the name Saracen. They call themselves Hagarines, which means from the line of Hagar. They call themselves Ishmaelites, again from the line of Hagar through Ishmael. They call themselves Maghrib, which means from the Maghreb, which is the area they come from. And they use the word Mahajirun to refer to themselves. Because these people are conquering, and they are moving into the vacuum that existed there in the Sassanid Empire. And they're taking over Basra and Baghdad. They then go up and take over Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo. They are conquering these people, but they don't call themselves Muslims. That's the problem. And there's no religion called Islam. There's no reference anywhere to Islam until Abd al-Malik. It's Abd al-Malik in 691 and 692 that introduces those names. We can't find any documentation earlier than that date. Now, why haven't we heard this before? The first reference to the word Islam itself is on the Dome of the Rock, which was built in 691 by Abd al-Malik as the greatest structure of its day in contradistinction to the Byzantine power. And you can see it is Abd al-Malik that creates this Arab identity. And in order to create this Arab identity, he has to have a place that's bigger than any other, and that's why he builds the Dome of the Rock. But take a look at the only original part of the Dome of the Rock that still exists today. It's been destroyed and rebuilt 11 times. You need to go to the inner ambulatory and read the Arabic inscriptions along those inner ambulatory, and they are all against Jesus Christ. They're against our Lord. Islam in its very nascence was a rebellion against the divinity of Jesus Christ. Say not three, for God is one, and he has no partners. That's Surah 4, Ayah 171. That comes straight out of the Quran. That's on the Dome of the Rock. Reference after reference attacking this person called Isa. Now that's fascinating, because there's nothing that speaks about why that building was built. Muslims say that building was built to commemorate the Miraj. Remember I talked about the Miraj earlier when Muhammad went up to the 7 heavens right there on that rock and met Allah and met Moses, bounced back and forth between and got 50 prayers down to 5 prayers? That's called the Miraj. That's why that building was built. Take a look at any of the inscriptions and find any reference to the Miraj. You won't find any reference. What's more, the Dome of the Rock doesn't have a Qibla. Ooh, hold on a minute. I'm going to actually contradict myself in about 10 minutes. Hold on to that. You'll see why. There is no Qibla in the Dome of the Rock. Yet this is the third most holy shrine in Islam today, built in 691 by Abd al-Malik. But here's the real clincher, and this is the one that really hurts Muslims. There is no reference to a city called Mecca until 741. We can't find any reference. Patricia Crono is the first one to find this out. We'll get into that a little bit later. 741, no reference anywhere to a city called Mecca. Now remember, Mecca is pretty important for Islam. Mecca is where Adam and Eve were sent to in Surah 7, ayah 24. When they were sent down from the Garden of Eden, they were sent down to Mecca according to the traditions. Mecca is where Abraham and Ishmael rebuilt the Kaaba in the 1900 BC. Mecca is a center of trade, north, south, east, and west. It is where Muhammad was born. It is where he grew up. It is where the Kaaba has always been. It's the center of the earth. You've got a problem if there's no reference to it until 741. Muhammad died in 632. You do your maths. Are you following what I'm saying? The first biography, as you already know, the first biography we even hear about this man Muhammad is not till the 9th century, 833. Now, let's talk with the geography. Let's unpack this and show you what we're talking about. When you look at the Quran, you will find that there are 65 references to geographical locations in the Quran. This is what Dr. Gan Gibson has pointed out. Over and over again, you find references, especially 3 places. 3 people, the people of Ad, which is the biblical Uz. The people of Thamud. 23 times it refers to the people of Ad. And that this prophet, but it doesn't name who this prophet is. It just says this prophet living at that place, the place of the prophet, the settlement of the prophet. It doesn't give a name to where this prophet comes from. If you look in the Quran, you will find Muhammad's name is only found 4 times. That should be troubling in and of itself. How many times is Issa's name found in the Quran? Anybody know? 93 times. Who do you think is more important, Jesus or Muhammad? If you're just going to look at numbers. But we're not going to just look at numbers. But it certainly does talk about a prophet. But where does he live? You will only find 1 reference to Mecca in the entire Quran, and that's in Surah 48, ayah 24. But it does talk about that this prophet has contact with these people from Ad 23 times, these people from Thamud 24 times, these people from Midian 7 times. So it seems pretty important that these people are living right around where this prophet lives. But take a look and see where Ad, Midian, and Thamud are. Look at the map. They're up in Jordan, 600 miles further north. Mecca's way down here. I wish I had a pointer. Can you see where Mecca is on the map? There's Ad, Thamud, and Midian, and here's Mecca way down here. It's 600 miles off key, further north. You've got a problem here. What's more, Mecca is only referred to once, Surah 48, ayah 4, and there you see, it doesn't really say much. The valley of Mecca, after he made his voices, so it's in a valley. We do some more things about Mecca. We're told also that there's little vegetation there. We find that it's in a valley, that this place where the prophet lives, remember, it's not Mecca itself, it's just saying where the prophet lives, has a stream going through it, has a parallel valley. It has a pillar of salt, that the prophet goes out in the morning, passes this pillar of salt, which would be the wife of Lot, who's turned to salt, and then comes back in the evening, passing this pillar of salt again. So it's pretty close to where this prophet lives, if he can go back walking and coming back walking, passing it, right? That it has fields, trees, grass, clay, loam. It has olive trees. And here's the clincher. This place has olive trees. That has a mountain overlooking the Kaaba. That's that square building. But take a look at Mecca. It is not in a valley. There is no parallel valley. There is no stream going through Mecca. It doesn't even have water. It only has 1 well, the Zamzam well, which cannot even accommodate the caravans supposedly that went there. There is no clay, grass, loam. There is no stream at all. And certainly there are no olive trees. There are no olive trees in all of Arabia. The only olive trees you will find are in the Mediterranean, 600 miles further north. Ooh, I love this. You'll see why this becomes even more damaging. Now, what do the traditions tell us? Well, the traditions tell us that Mecca is a center of Islam, that it is also appointed for mankind, was that at Bakka. But is that Mecca? Bakka and Mecca. How many people speak Arabic here or read and write Arabic? Okay, none here. If you look at the Arabic, you have 3 consonants for every word. Bakaka would be the form for Becca. Makaka would be the 3 consonantal form for Mecca. Completely different consonantal form. You cannot appropriate one with the other. It's a totally different word. And that's why Muslims are confused. And the only Muslims that argue this are ones that don't speak Arabic. It's the mother of all settlements. We know wherever this prophet comes from. Yet, the only reference we find is in Surah 48, ayah 22. So, did Muhammad come from here? That's what we're asking. And is it the center of the Qibla? We're going to come to that. Let's just take a look at a map from the 7th century. That's the trade routes. If this is the center of trade, take a look and see. Do you find Mecca on it? It's where that question mark is. Why is Mecca not on the trade route? We can't find any map that has Mecca on it. But take a look at what is at the center of all the trade. Right here. What's that town right there? Petra. Petra is at the center of all the trade routes. So hold that so you can see that. Here's the trade route coming up from the sea. There is the Red Sea. Now, Dr. Patricia Corona looked at this map back in the 1980s. This is a map from the 7th century, looking at all the cities in the 7th century. And you can see the trade route here from Aden, and according to all the trade route theory put out by Montgomery Watt, all the trade came from India or from China way over in here. It came across, it couldn't go this way because of the Hindu Kush and the Himalaya mountains. So that it always had to come across the Arabian Sea, up through the Persian Gulf, and then they would go across the Persian Gulf, through the Sassanid area, over into the Byzantine area, and into the Mediterranean. That's where the trade has always been. Until the Sassanids were warring with the Byzantines. These two big civilizations were coming together, were warring back and forth with each other, and that shut down the trade route. So they had to redirect the trade route, which went from the west coast of India, right across the Arabian Sea, over here to Aden. Took off all their goods there in Aden, and they went up the trade route, which is that green line, right up through Najran, Sana, up to Taif, which is right here. Then they went down off the plateau, down to Mecca, which is here, 1,000 feet, came back up 1,000 feet to get to Yathrib, Khaybar, Tabuk, and on up to Gaza in the north. That's the trade route theory that every Muslim believes is the historical event. Dr. Patricia Cronin looked at that map and found two problems almost immediately. Let's see if any of you can find two problems. My 10-year-old son found two problems. Let's see if you're as clever as my 10-year-old son. What's the problem with that theory? Not the mountains. That is a plateau, by the way. That is the Western Plateau. You're almost there. What's wrong with the Western Plateau? And where's Mecca? Is Mecca on the Western Plateau? No, it's off the Western Plateau a good 1,000 feet. You've got to come down the 1,000 feet to a place that has no water. So how could that be an oasis for caravans? That has no grass, no clay, no loam, nothing to accommodate caravans. Then go back up 1,000 feet to get up to Yathrib, all right? So you go from Taif, here, down to Mecca, then back up to Yathrib. Okay, the Yathrib is the archaic name for what is today Medina. But what's the biggest problem with that theory? Look at the water. What's that? There you go. Give him a hand. He gets it. If you have all the trade coming on water anyways, it's already on boats, it's on ship, coming across the Arabian Sea, why would you take them off ship and go 1,250 miles by land when you have a waterway going right up here, the Red Sea? Dr. Patricia Corona found that if you take a ton of goods just 50 miles by land, it would cost the same amount as 1,250 miles by sea. It's a no-brainer. Even today, all our goods are sent by sea because it's the easiest way to send huge amounts of goods because it costs very little to push a boat on the ocean, or in that case, even using wind sails. But to go overland, you have to have camels, you have to feed them, you have to water them, you have to have oases, you have to be able to protect them against the dacoits and all the other robbers along the way. You have to pay for every place you stop at. Can you see why it's so expensive? So why would they have gone overland when they had the waterway there? So she decided to go back and check this out. Now remember, she reads and writes 15 languages. So she went back to all the original documents, written in all the Akkadian, Nabatean. She went back to the Assyrian documents. She went back to all the See, there was no Arabic back then. Arabic is a new language. But it comes out of the Nabatean script. And she went and she found out that there was no trade whatsoever that went up the western coast that went through a place called Mecca. There's no reference anywhere to Mecca. All the trade was maritime, and it was all done by the Ethiopians and the Eritreans. What is today Eritrea? Here, they controlled the trade. They were the boat people. The Arabs did not like the sea. They were camel herders. They were people who loved the desert. That's why their names are on no Arab names are on any of these documents. She said, why hadn't anybody looked at this before? Well, if you don't have Mecca on the trade route, then what do you do with Mecca? So she went and she decided to find out where the first reference she came to was the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius Continuata Byzantia Arabica, which was from the early reign of Caliph Hisham in 741. That's the first time Mecca even comes into existence on any documentation. That's over 100 years after Muhammad. You've got a problem. The first time it's put on any map is not till 900 AD. That's almost 250 years later. So, Take a look at Mecca today. Now, this is what's interesting. If you look at Mecca today, you can see there's a huge building program going on. All these skyscrapers. There's the fourth largest, tallest building in the world right there. The great big clock tower that they've now built. That clock tower, that clock is 45 feet across. They want to make it center of time. They want to change it from Greenwich Mean Time to Meccan Mean Time, MMT. It's designed after Big Ben in London, much, much bigger. This is the future plans for Mecca. But look what they're doing. In order to build all these buildings, they're destroying Khadija's house. They made Khadija's house, the wife of Muhammad, into toilets. Cemented it completely over. Muhammad's own house, where he was born, is now a library, completely destroyed. Here is where the Ottomans had their great hill. That has been made into the tower. Almost all of this. This is the Grand Bazaar here. Has now been made into where the mosque used to be. It's now being made into a parking lot. Why do you think they're doing this? And why is it no Muslims are complaining? They're destroying the historical record. They don't want anybody to know and to ask the questions we're now asking about Mecca. Now here's the problem. If you don't have Mecca and you don't have the Kaaba, then what are you going to do with the Qibla? The Qibla is the direction of prayer that every Muslims pray, right? And you go to any mosque, you'll see a mihrab, which would be a niche in a wall that is always pointed towards Mecca. It doesn't matter where it is in the world, you will see where Mecca is. And if you go, and if you're flying, as I did on Malaysian Airlines, you can see there is a screen on the plane that shows you where Mecca is moving, and so you can get in the aisle and pray at any time of the day. You can always see where Mecca is moving on as the plane moves. There's the mihrab right there in a mosque. In my hotel room there in Kuala Lumpur, I even had an arrow in my hotel room showing where the Qibla was. So if I was a good Muslim, I would know where Mecca was. You always have to know what Mecca was. And remember, Mecca was canonized in 624. 2 years after Muhammad moved to Medina, he then canonized it in 624. That's in Surah 2, ayah 145 to 149. It's in the Quran as well. Today, you just have a map on your phone. You can find out where the Qibla is. Surah 2, 143 to 145 says that the direction of the Qibla is changed, but it doesn't say from where. And Gibson, in the last 20 years, has put together probably the best work on looking at all the earliest mosques. And what he didn't just want to look at the mosques as they were today, because the mosques have been destroyed and rebuilt many times over the years. He wanted to see what they were like in the 7th century. Again, going back to the time when they were built, originally built. But to do that, he had to look at the original floor plans. In order to do that, he had to film them from space, looking down onto the citadels of each mosque. So looking at the perimeters of each mosque, the original perimeters. And this is what he found. Here's the great mosque of Guangzhou in China. We're talking about China. Built in 630. This is before Muhammad died. Look at the Qibla. Where is it facing? Petra. Not facing Mecca. The Humayma mosque, this is his mosque in Jordan. It's completely almost 180 degrees off. And the new mosque now, the one at the bottom right-hand side, is the new mosque. It is now facing Mecca. But the old mosque it was facing Petra. The great mosque in Baalbek in Lebanon, it's facing Petra. The great mosque of Sana'a in Yemen, capital city of Yemen. Look at the date, 705. The Qibla was canonized in 624. Muhammad died in 632. We're into the 8th century now, 705. It's facing Petra. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, and this is interesting because here you have the Dome of the Rock right there, and here you have the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and here is the great enclosure. The entire enclosure, including the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa, that's built in 691. This is built in 709. See, you see almost 20 years between these two buildings. They're both facing Petra. The whole citadel is facing Petra, and it's still facing Petra today. Here's the Damascus Mosque in 709. It's facing Petra. The Anjar Mosque in Lebanon, 714. It's facing Petra. It should be facing Mecca. The Mosque of Umar Basra in Syria. Look at the date, 720. We're almost 100 years later. It's facing Petra. It should be facing Mecca. Finally, in 727, the Banbor Mosque in Pakistan. Finally, it's got the right direction. But remember, the Qibla was canonized in 624. We're talking about over 100 years later. They finally got the right direction. However, in Syria, in 728, here you find a mosque that's not facing Mecca or Petra. They got a real confusion going on there. And when you get down to this one, this is really interesting. This is here in Amman in Jordan. Here you have the older mosque, which is built in 700. It's facing Petra. And then a newer mosque is built in 740. it's finally facing Mecca. So between 700 and 740, something happened that changed the direction of the mosques. But then in 743, back to Petra again. So they're still not sure where they should be facing. When you get to North Africa, it gets even more confusing because all the mosques in North Africa, like Tunisia here in 770, it's not facing Petra or Mecca. It's facing somewhere further south. It's the same with Cordoba, Spain, in 784. It's not facing Petra, Mecca, but it's facing the same place that the Tunisian mosque is facing. And that's the same case with here in Tunisia from 870. So now we're into the 9th century, and they're not facing Petra or Mecca. So what did he find? He found that every mosque, uniformly, up until 725, are all facing Petra. And it's not that they're confused. They're uniformly facing Petra. Not one of them is facing Jerusalem like we thought. We were off by 3 to 5 degrees. Shame on us. We didn't do our homework. Thank goodness for Dan Gibson. Every mosque up until 725 is facing Petra. And then between 725 and 822, for the next roughly 100 years, 12% face Petra, 50% start to face Mecca, 38 aren't sure where they're supposed to face. It's not till 822 that every mosque face Mecca. That's 200 years too late. It takes them 200 years to finally get it right. Now, this came up in the debate we had on Sunday. And he said, well, they were actually, if you look at it carefully, they were looking at the summer solstice and the winter solstice. And I said, no, they're not. Because every mosque up until 725 is facing exactly the same direction. He says, well, they didn't know direction very well. I said, listen, these were camel herders. They had no roads to follow. There were no macadam in those days. How did they find their route? How did they know to go from oasis to oasis on shifting sand? They used the stars. They knew exactly direction. Otherwise, they would be dead. But the fact is, they knew their direction well. That's why every mosque from all these countries, even as far away as China, were all exactly facing Petra, uniformly. Now, take a look and you can see why they're facing Petra. And you'll see why Petra is so important. There is Mecca. That's Petra. How many people here have been to Petra? Anybody at all been there? None of you? Okay. If you go to Petra, you will find it's a city of tombs and temples. It is the seat of the Nabatean kingdom. This is the great Nabatean empire that came into its ascendancy in the 2nd century BC. The Nabatean empire is where we get Arabic from. Arabic comes from Nabatea. The word Allah is a Nabatean god. Allah is the god of the Nabatean, who also has another name, Hubal. And Allah has a wife named Alat, and has 2 daughters, Al-Manat and Al-Uzza. Anybody know what I've just said? Who is Alat, Al-Manat, and Al-Uzza? Have you heard that name before? If you've read the Quran, you'll have heard that name. That's in Surah 51, Ayah 23. Am I right there? Surah 53, Ayah 21 and 19 and 20. Look in Surah 53 and you will see that's the satanic verses that made popular by Salman Rushdie. Alat, Al-Manat, and Al-Uzza. Who are these 3 goddesses? We now know who they are. They are the wife of Allah and the daughters of Alat and Allah. So if Allah is one and he has no son, what's he doing with 2 daughters? Ooh, I love it. Bingo. They've got a bigger problem. They've got the wrong God. They've got the Nabatean God. More than that, they have got all of these mosques that were built, all facing Petra. They continue to face Petra all the way up until the 8th century. But more than that, take a look at Petra. Petra is in a valley. It has a parallel valley. It has a stream. It has fields, trees, grass, clay, loam. It has olive trees. It's near the pillar of salt that this prophet goes by in the morning and comes back in the evening. Petra is in a valley. It has all the items listed above. In other words, it has everything that the Quran's talking about. All the geographical locations. And take a look and see around what Petra is. This. Significance? Well, we know nothing about Muhammad until the 7th century from within Arab sources. His biography doesn't appear until the 9th century. His city of Mecca isn't referred to until the 8th century. Thus, much of what we know of Muhammad is written down hundreds of years later and hundreds of miles away. It looks like it's nothing more than a later redaction, possibly by Abd al-Malik. And that's why we're now looking at Abd al-Malik afresh. It looks like everything begins with him. How do we know this? Well, before we get into it, let's see what Humphreys comes up. Islam in the Prophet's life as we know it was not derived from the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years and then redacted back onto the Prophet's life and compiled in the 9th century.